3, 4,
5,
6, 7, 8. In the affirmative debating from Joel Barlow will be Nicolo, Marzaro, and Brendan Coppinger. By common consent, in the negative will be Cormac, Cummiskey, and Cooper D'Agostino.
My name is Brendan Coppinger, and together with my partner Nicolo Marzaro, we will be urging the affirmative of the resolution that cities and towns should have the final decision on whether to permit for drilling and fracking for oil and natural gas. We have a quick plan that I'm going to go over in a few minutes, in addition to 3 contentions. I'm going to get into my plan now. We wanted to start with the federal government establishing minimum regulations such as distance from residential houses and bodies of water, as well as limits on noise pollution and air pollution. You could keep going on. After the federal government minimums, you're going to move down to the state, and county governments are allowed to provide additional regulation as they see fit. And finally, the last step of the process is going to be the local government. We're going to provide a 3rd tier of additional regulations if they see fit, and are allowed to give the final yay-nay vote, not only for the industry as a whole of fracking, but also for individual companies, and the final decision on where to place these businesses. We have 3 contentions in defense of our side of the resolution. Our first contention is that giving the final decision to cities and towns brings significant environmental benefits. Our second contention is that doing the same thing brings economic benefits. And our 3rd contention is that it is infeasible and unjust to control this on a state-by-state or federal basis. Going back more into depth on my first contention, giving the final decision to cities and towns brings significant environmental benefits. I think the key thing to realize here is that your local governments are going to be far more interested in the nearby environment. You're going to care much more about how your own community looks than a few legislators in DC or in the economic or population capital of whatever state you happen to be in. Let's take Connecticut, for example. I very much like, I think we have a nice yard out front in front of Barlow. I don't want somebody all the way up in Hartford trying to make decisions about whether we can put oil drilling platforms in front of the greens in Easton. I want it to be on a town-by-town decision so that the Eastonites will decide, or the Readingites as it be, what happens in your respective town. Additionally, the environmental effects that possibly come from fracking are going to be happening on a local level. When pollutants leak out from the various fracking engines, you're going to be seeing them on a local level, in local rivers, in the local air quality, and you're not really going to be seeing them in places like Hartford or further away. The problem with states is that they see the big revenue and they ignore the environmental effects. And in addition, we have, I'm going to move on to my second contention now, dealing with the economic benefits. And the key thing here is that you can, with the amount of power that the towns have, they can create local jobs where they're needed. If you look at North Dakota, they have an unemployment rate of 3.2, which is the lowest nationally, because they allow this fracking. And so if a town was ever in an environmental hardship, then if the town was ever in economic hardship, fiscal difficulties, then they could allow fracking or increase their issuing of fracking permits to stimulate the economy really quick. Quick thing about fracking, it's what's known as a floating business, which means you can move from one place to another very quickly. You can set up a timetable of like a year for them to establish a fracking plant, drain some oil out, and then leave. So you can apply for some very quick economic stimulus in times of hardship. In addition, it establishes some extra control over property values that the towns may want to have, making increasing competition for certain properties or decreasing competition to manage the prices. For my 3rd contention, we believe that it is infeasible and unjust to control this on a state-by-state or federal basis. I already stated that it seems kind of weird for a decision that is going to be affecting the people locally to be happening somewhere far away, like in Hartford or something. But additionally, on a more federal basis, it seems to me that the only government agency that would be able to have control over this would be the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, seeing as if you gave it to something like the Department of Energy, you'd end up with like the drill baby drill scenarios. And then the EPA itself doesn't really have a very strong track record in regards to keeping the environment safe and keeping the environment pure. I mean, you have the various coal slurries that are in West Virginia that are polluting a lot of the groundwater there. I mean, if they've done such a great job with coal plants, I'm sure we can trust them with our fracking plants. And in addition, there's an inability to handle nuclear waste, where apparently the EPA is under the misconception that putting a wire cage around nuclear material makes it safe. As sort of solvency, we see that Texas has managed to have very strong regulations on a town-by-town, municipality-based basis. You can, yeah, so basically, final message from the affirmative side is that you can have people who are living away from all these various oil fields making decisions for the people who are living on top of those oil fields. And I yield the rest of my time, and I now send it for cross-examination.
All right, so Barlow is sort of in between Easton and Reading, right?
Sure.
So what if Reading decides to make a decision to promote fracking or oil drilling, but Easton doesn't? What happens under the affirmative plan?
Then Reading allows fracking and Easton doesn't, on a town-by-town basis.
Well, wouldn't Easton potentially be reaping ecological detriments in the form of pollution?
Yeah, no. We established in the affirmative plan that you'd be having multiple regulations going down on the federal, state, and local levels, so that hopefully by the time it got to the local levels there would be massive regulations to the point where your environmental externalities, negative externalities, will be reduced or perhaps eliminated altogether. In addition, if they aren't eliminated altogether, the externalities to begin with are already so small as...
All right, thanks. All right, so let's address a point that was made during your second contention, that of economic benefits. And you specifically brought up the example of North Dakota as having a really low unemployment rate, right?
Yeah.
So was the fracking there established by localities and municipalities, or was it established by the state?
The example that I wanted to bring up in North Dakota, I think it's actually kind of irrelevant.
Could you answer my question?
Yes, I'm pretty sure it was set up by the state, but the point is that fracking practices reduce the unemployment rate overall, which they could do set up under the state or local governments. You're welcome.
Now, with regards to your third contention, did you not state that the EPA is the only regulatory agency that could have oversight over these matters?
Well, on the federal level, it seems to me like...
On the federal level, yes, correct?
Yeah,
but are there not state regulatory agencies?
Yeah, sure, you could go state by state.
Thank you.
But it seems to me like if you go state by state...
Furthermore, isn't the EPA grossly underfunded?
Yeah, the EPA is horrible, I hate it.
All right, so you brought up the issue of, in your first contention, that local governments would be invested in their own environment and therefore should be the only ones who can make yes or no decisions. But couldn't one feasibly have a system in which the local governments simply serve in an advisory capacity and still serve the purpose of preventing unwise decisions from being made?
Yes, I guess that kind of works. I don't think it works as effectively as the plan proposed by the affirmative, but I suppose you could have it in an advisory capacity.
Right, so before the resolution today and before reading the pack and all the other resources, did you think fracking was a good thing or a bad thing?
No, I recognize that, it was actually a long story. I saw like a documentary on fracking like a few months ago, and I realized that when you actually look at all the different statistics, there's nothing wrong with it. It's kind of like nuclear power in that way, where everyone doesn't like it, like the NIMBY stuff.
Thank you kindly.
You're welcome.
Everyone doesn't like it? Is that what you said?
Well, I mean...
Did you just say everyone doesn't like it? Okay.
Time's up. All right, cool.
Can we take 1 minute of prep time to start out with, please? Hello, my name is Cormac Cummiskey, and I, alongside my partner Cooper D'Agostino, am here today representing Joel Barlow High School to urge a negative ballot on the resolution cities and towns should have the final decision on whether to permit drilling and fracking for oil and natural gas. I would like to begin by enumerating and elaborating upon our 3 contentions, and then, should time permit, moving on to address a few points that have come up in my opponent's first constructive speech and following cross-examination period and clashing with them. Our contentions are as follows. 1, state and federal control over this decision will result in great, and in fact greater, economic benefits. Contention 2, the ecological benefits of fracking outweigh the detriments and will be maximized by keeping the decision at the state level. And contention 3, local and municipal governments do not have sufficient resources or expertise to make this decision in a sound manner. Now, to elaborate upon my first contention, that state and federal control over this decision will result in the greatest economic benefits. The fact of the matter is, state and federal governments have a greater incentive than municipal and local governments to frack, as I will elaborate upon in my following contentions. But primarily this is because of the great economic benefits that can be reaped by fracking. Economic benefits that state and federal governments are very keen to capitalize upon. If we look at a single well, we see that this results in a $2.8 million boost in revenue from direct purchases from gas companies alone. $1.2 million in indirect revenue are generated, $1.5 million from spending wages, $2 million in taxes, and 62 jobs per every single well. States have successfully implemented models in order to reap these economic benefits, principally Pennsylvania. In Pennsylvania, 72,000 jobs were created over a course of merely 2 years from a prioritization of fracking. And we see that this is a model that could be adopted by many more states and could yield great benefits. Now, to elaborate on my second contention, that maintaining the decision-making authority at the state level would result in great ecological benefits, which outweigh any potential detriments of fracking. The primary ecological benefit is a decreased carbon footprint. The burning of natural gas extracted through fracking results in 30 to 50% less greenhouse gas emissions than the burning of coal, which is currently our primary source of electricity generation. Now, if we do not shift to fracking, which would in turn shift to a greater use of natural gas, we will have to rely just as heavily, if not more heavily, upon coal, which will result in the dissemination of particulate matter into the environment that causes slow death and terrible disease. Furthermore, any claims that fracking is intrinsically connected to health detriments are fundamentally unsound. If we look at the claim that fracking contaminates groundwater, this is not the case. So long as ethical and safe procedures are followed, companies drill around aquifers to avoid any potential contamination of said bodies of water. Furthermore, impermeable levels of rock between the aquifers and the lower gas extraction levels shield the water from potential harm. Another claim is that cancer rates in communities that allow fracking are higher. This is also spurious. A study of communities, including Dish, Texas, showed that communities that embrace fracking have no higher cancer rates than the rest of the United States. Lastly, my third contention, that local and municipal governments simply do not have sound judgment when making this decision. The fact of the matter is misconceptions are rampant regarding fracking. I ask you, do you want to have an oil rig in your backyard? Would you allow someone to erect a fracking apparatus behind your kid's high school or anywhere within your town lines, so to speak? I don't think so. But why is this? It's because people believe that there are health detriments to this. They believe that fracking is a public risk, a public menace that's going to decrease your property values and make your kids sick. Well, as I've explained in my first contention, in my second contention rather, ecological detriments of fracking are negligible at best when fracking is conducted along ethical lines. And furthermore, your community could benefit greatly from the economic benefits. And as a result, we hold that communities who don't understand this reality, which is basically every single town in the United States, will be disincentivized to embrace fracking when fracking is okay. And when fracking is not okay, local communities can be corrupted by fracking officials, by oil and gas company money. If you have a town board of 5 select people versus an entire state legislature, it's much easier for a company to buy off that group of people. Now, to clash with the few points that came up in my opponent's speech. In their first contention, they held that there are greater environmental benefits of giving this decision to the local governments because their local governments are more invested in the ecological well-being of the towns. We hold that the states are every bit as interested in promoting the ecological well-being of the people, primarily because elected officials from the local governments already have a say in the matter. As to their second contention, that economic benefits would result, we hold that the state governments are better equipped to coordinate large-scale job-creating initiatives, and fracking is just one such initiative that the state should have control over. Lastly, they hold it is infeasible and unjust to give it to the state governments. particularly because regulatory bodies like the EPA are allegedly inefficient, we hold that this is not the case. Look at the successes of the EPA, including the Clean Water and the Clean Air Act. We hold that state and federal regulators can succeed in coordinating these measures. And once again, I urge a negative ballot on the resolution. Thank you, and I now open myself up for cross-examination.
So, so you would be using the EPA in order to regulate this measure as your agency?
Potentially. They're but one tool that we can use in order to regulate this in conjunction with state and local regulatory bodies.
Okay, like which regulatory bodies?
Connecticut has a, for example, has a commission on energy production and mining, I think, within the state. I don't know how much mining is done in Connecticut, but if Connecticut was to investigate any potential fracking activities, this would be the body that could take care of that.
All right, so putting fracking aside for a second, Texas has a huge history of drilling in general, right?
Yes.
Yeah, all right. Are you aware that Texas actually has some of the strictest regulations on drilling, both fracking and conventional?
Texas, the state does, yes.
All right. Are you aware that the regulations are actually delivered by the individual towns and municipalities?
They're enforced by individual towns and municipalities. However, they originate on the state level, and from there, they extend up to the federal level. I think we hold that regulation is best done from the top down in this case.
Okay, so if the EPA was so successful with their Safe and Clean Water Act, then why do their own coal slurries contaminate our drinking water?
We hold that this is an example of malpractice and criminal activity on the parts of the firms that conducted it, and not the fault of the EPA itself. These EPA regulations clash directly with slurries and coal slags, and that enforcement mechanisms need to be prioritized in order to eliminate such occurrences in the future.
So the corporations were able to get away with it beyond the oversight of the
In this case. However, if we're prioritizing state oversight and federal oversight, then we hold that, in fact, we will be able...
And also in the case of when it comes down to...
We're not talking about nuclear waste.
Well, I'm just
we're talking about fracking, baby.
You feel that way, Cormac. Okay, so by what you just said, do corporations typically, always value regulations?
When you put the law on their tail, they do.
Okay. And does the EPA do a great job of putting the law on people's tails?
If they have their sidekick, the let's see. So, like, if you equate the EPA to the Lone Ranger, then his sidekick would be Tonto, the state regulatory agencies.
Don't you think you're disgracing Chuck Norris's name or the Lone Ranger? No, that's
Chuck Norris is not the Lone Ranger.
I was thinking that the show where he's the sheriff. I forget what it's called.
Walker, Texas
Ranger. Okay, so are you?
Oh, and that brings me back to Texas, that lovely state with all the state regulations.
Okay. Is that the time zone card?
It might as well have been.
Then, that's the time zone. Okay, thank you, Cormac. Hello, my name is Nicolo Marzaro, and with my partner Brendan Coppinger, I'm here to further urge the affirmation of the aforementioned resolve. Now in this speech, I'm going to go right into my opponent's case and point out the shortfalls of this case, and if time permits, I'm going to go back and rebuild upon our own case. So, beginning with my opponent's first contention, which is the idea of the state and federal economy will reap the benefits of this policy. And the fact is that fracking can't occur all throughout every state. It occurs in certain towns. And the towns where it will occur are the towns that are going to opt to legalize this kind of practice. But either way, the fact is that when this occurs, yes, the state and the federal government are trying to reap a profit. But this often happens at the expense of municipalities and local governments that don't want this fracking activity occurring. For instance, the fact is that if you have a poll in New York, per se, to vote, an initiative, a referendum, where you're voting whether or not fracking can occur, if the urban population, like the people in New York City, those 30 million people, decide, or however million people, decide that they want fracking because they'll get none of the negative externalities but all of the benefits, they're going to vote for it. While the people in the rural environments who don't want it in their backyard, as my opponents brought up, will have to suffer these consequences despite their own choice not to do so. Furthermore, going into their second contention, which is the ecological benefits outweigh the negatives. Now, our opponents bring up the facts that they're decreasing the carbon footprint because now everyone is going to be fracking all over the United States. However, the fact is, by making every single place that is able to withstand the capacity to frack, to take all the petroleum and the natural gas out of these pieces of land, what's going to occur is that you are going to use more and more as the prices drop. We are going to use more of this natural gas. And while, for example, ton for ton, natural gas may release less emissions when burned, the fact is that when you're using much more natural gas than you would be using coal currently, because the cheaper prices, you have a much greater carbon footprint. And that is something that we on Side Affirmative oppose. We do not want a larger carbon footprint. We want a better environment. We want better human health, less particulate matter, and less deadly diseases like cancer. Furthermore, going into their third contention, they contend that local governments do not have the capacity or the expertise to make these kind of decisions. And they bring up the fact that there's rampant misconceptions about the detriments of fracking. The fact is, though, there are no conclusive long-term studies on horizontal drilling using fracking for that matter that support that there are no health detriments. And when we're talking about something like fracking, about putting unknown chemicals under your ground that can possibly contaminate your water that you drink, that is not something we want to take the slightest risk on. So while our opponents say there are these misconceived notions and these rampant misconceptions, is that something you want to risk? Are you going to allow fracking for the possible economic benefits and risk your life for that? Here on Side Affirmative, we believe that is an unwise decision. Furthermore, they bring up that state legislators aren't going to be able to regulate. They're not going to be able to regulate on the local level because they don't have this capacity. However, as we pointed out in our plan, the fact is we are going to have federal regulation, then state regulation, then local decides whether or not you can frack on that land. They get the final decision. Thus, we are going to have these state regulators. Yes, going back into our own case, beginning with our plan. As I mentioned, we have the federal regulations, we have the state regulations, and we have the final say for the municipalities, for the local government.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Cooper D'Agostino, and along with my partner Cormac Cummiskey, I'd like to continue urging a negative ballot on the aforementioned resolution. Now, during this speech, I'd like to break down Side Affirmative's case and Side Negative's case and show why overall Side Negative's case still stands triumphant. Now, that being said, let's look at Side Affirmative's case. So let's look first at their plan, which is overall, one, have minimal regulations from the federal level, more regulations from the state level, and then finally the local yes or no. Now, overall, with the first two parts of this plan, we see that these are kind of already in place with the Clean Water and Clean Air Act. So they're sort of redundant and don't have much value within the course of this debate. But let's grant it that they are enacting some regulatory measures. The key problem comes in the third plank in giving the localities and municipalities the yes or no answer. Because if we look to the course of history, and indeed the course of this audience and everyone in this room, we see that localities are more likely to be afraid of the possible ecological and economic advantages due to misinformation or bring on more risk due to corruption. So that being said, let's look at the three contentions of Side Affirmative. The first affirmative contention is that of environmental benefit from having the states and locales doing this. The first problem we see is that overall, you would see a far greater ecological benefit if you did this on a state level with the state making the decisions per town. Like, okay, I'm the state government and I noticed that Bridgeport could benefit from having a drill for either oil or in the fracking process on one side of the town. And the state could do that. And it's far less red tape and it's far more efficient, and they're far more inclined to do so as they have the resources and the information at their disposal. Whereas the town is more prone to be like, oh, fracking? That sounds kind of scary. And that's the mentality that we see throughout the board today. And if you negate the resolution, you don't see that. Now, furthermore, under this idea of the environmental benefit, we see that overall, one of the key reasons why municipalities don't frack as much is because of NIMBY, the very idea of not in my backyard, and that lobbyists have a significant amount of power when they make this kind of decision, and they're lauded over it when they utterly ignore the economic and ecological benefits of it. This being said, let's look at the second value of their overall economic benefit that's supposed under Side Affirmative. Now, our second affirmative speaker really brought up the question of at whose expense is this going to come if we reap a greater economic benefit under Side Negative, which we've asserted through the evidence of the precedent we've seen around us in Pennsylvania and North Dakota. The main question here is not at whose expense, but as whose detriment. and that the detriment is nigh non-existent within the course of the various different methods of safety that we have with the multiple levels of EPA, Center of Disease Control, and state and local regulatory agencies. There's only one toxin or one particulate matter that comes from the oil drilling or the fracking process, and that's carbon monoxide. And with the proper amount of regulation, you can keep that in check. Whereas with coal, you have ammonia, formaldehyde, and a list of contaminants that goes on for 36 pages on any Wikipedia website. So overall, we see far more detriment by limiting the amount of fracking we have through doing it on the local level, by having them say yes or no. Not to mention the issue of red tape, and that suppose Easton decided to frack and Reading didn't, that would cause a massive lawsuit, since our water resources are tied so knitly together because of our local reservoir. And that would be a huge debacle that would occur on affirmative world and wouldn't occur in negative world. And that being said, let's look at the third issue, that of justice, and that we can consider the red tape too. And then we see there's two main problems with affirmative's case in this respect. One is the value of eminent domain, in which the state government can seize land for the better of the public good, which in economic and ecological terms is clearly a public good in this case. And we also have to look at the second issue of that the EPA supposedly being ineffective because it's unable to stop coal slurries, which are sort of like those drinks you get at DQ, but a lot more dangerous. So this falls on three grounds. One, the EPA is grossly underfunded and should be funded properly. Two, there's no local end to support this. And three, there's not really being a big call to look at these things when there should be. And we need to have a proper system of regulations, and that's what side negative does have. It endorses those policies and regulations we already have while giving the states the final say and avoiding red tape debacles and giving greater ecological and economic benefit. That being said, let's look at side negative's case. Overall, in response to the clash against our first contention, we have to state that overall, the states have a actual merit in announcing a fracking process and providing it safety, because the individuals in those local towns and municipalities are voting for them. They have this merit to them. If we look at their response to our second contention, is that overall the ecological benefits don't seem apparent. Well, side negative's affirmative's point isn't really supported by the numbers. If we look at the studies, it's indicated in every respect that there will be a decrease in carbon emissions by 1.3%. So that's pretty sizable considering the massive size of our carbon emissions. And overall, we have better research because it's on a state level with far more resources. And finally, if we look at the value of municipalities being actually ineffective and not being able to do this, there's fewer of them, so they're more prone to corruption when you can't do a fracking process. And the risks that they may take on are illusory. And the misconceptions that have been around throughout our entire universe within our media are far too large for the municipalities to take on. And with that, I close the constructive speeches of the round and now stand open for cross-examination.
Okay, so really quickly, you just mentioned that 1.3% decrease in greenhouse gases.
Carbon footprint.
Carbon footprint, okay. Is there a timestamp on that?
It is. I know what you're going to say in that it is a long time, 2035, but if we consider the overall massive amount of emissions, that's significant.
Would you believe me if that wasn't where my line of questioning was going?
Wow.
Okay, so now let's say how much, that's 1.3 down from current levels, right?
Yes.
And would you say that our goals for carbon footprint reduction are already below 1.3 over, how many years was that again?
Hold on. Carry the 2. Sorry. I believe that would be 22 years. I'm sorry if I messed that up. You're good. Yep. Sorry, got it.
All right. So don't we have goals that say that we want to reduce our carbon footprint already by more than that in 22 years?
I'm not saying that doing this...
And so in doing that, aren't you actually increasing our carbon footprint over the long term?
No. It's a decrease in what we have...
Relatively speaking.
Yes, it's a decrease as opposed to coal, which
Okay.
is much more toxic. Furthermore, we're not saying this is a be-all, end-all solution. We believe that wind turbines, solar energy, and even nuclear energy need to be considered as options for the future.
All right, in addressing our first case, you keep talking about fracking and saying that there are no negative externalities to it, right? And for that reason, the government should fully allow it.
We recognize that perhaps, like in certain, it's a bad idea to frack right through a reservoir.
Hang on,
That's a bad idea.
Does a smart car have many negative externalities?
Well, I've never liked the look of smart cars.
You've never liked the look of them, but does that have anything to do with their economic benefits or their carbon footprint?
They do have economic benefits, and they do have an overall decreased carbon footprint.
All right, then why don't we have the government come in and mandate that everyone gets smart cars, because you're going to be saving lives that way?
Currently, most of it's attributed to really two reasons. One of which being the fact that they're really expensive and that the government's probably waiting for a time in which you can have feasible costs that everyone can pay for it. And the second major reason is that the production of them isn't large enough now.
Okay, so you stated that the not in my backyard mentality is outweighed by the economic and ecological benefits.
Yes, it currently dissuades that.
Are you going to volunteer to have the oil rig in your backyard? Who in this audience wants an oil rig in their backyard?
There's a
Raise your
good
hand.
point. There's actually a really good point when you go off of that. Seeing that the wages for these kinds of things are $23,000 larger than the average wage for someone. So actually getting a job there is looking pretty good for my prospects. Maybe a part-time job.
Okay, and you talked about how the oil industry is safe now, right? Because of the improved technology.
I'm not saying it's perfectly safe.
So there are fears, right? You know, like the BP oil spill.
Yeah, the BP oil spill is not only an
want that
outrage
in
in what
your backyard?
BP did as criminal activity, it's also an
Would
outrage
you like
in
that in your backyard? Wasn't the EPA regulating that too? Actually, yeah, they were.
The EPA was grossly underfunded at that period of time, not to mention that Britain wasn't adequately doing its job either.
Thank you.
Hello. Once again, my name is Cormac, Cummiskey, and I am here to continue urging the negation of the aforementioned resolution. As this debate boils down to a close, my partner and I would like to distill it down to three key considerations and explain why the negative triumphs on all three fronts. These three key considerations are those of ecology, economy, and practicality. As to the issue of ecology, as I have established throughout this round, by keeping the decision-making authority at the state level, we will overall see an increase in the amount of fracking across the board. And, as we have established, this could lead to widespread decrease in carbon footprint. That is what the negative stands for. We are standing for a solution that will benefit us going forward into the future, that will result in less particulate matter being emitted continually. However, the affirmative is not in favor of such a future. The affirmative is in favor of one in which state and local misgivings about fracking based upon misconceptions will lead to greater dependence upon coal and other forms of energy generation that will result in detriments to public health and to the environment as a whole. Whereas if you side with side negative, we will see a decrease in our carbon footprint. We will see a decrease in particulate matter, which ultimately will result in better health for the entire population. Now, as to the issue of economy, the negative stands for a future in which greater jobs are created through the fracking process. We stand for a future in which huge amounts of revenue through the fracking process can fill the coffers of local, state, and federal governments and result in more stimulus for economic activity across the board. While on the side affirmative, the affirmative believes that everything should be conducted on a micromanaged level. If we had every single town saying yay or nay to every single economic policy, every single industrial policy, nothing would ever get done. Because the fact of the matter is, people living in towns want their tiny little hamlets to be serene and perfect and pristine. And they don't want to look at the greater over economic plan. The state levels are better equipped to see the big picture. The state levels are better equipped to coordinate large-scale job growth. And that is why we need to keep decision-making authority in their hands. And this leads me on into my final consideration, that of practicality. Ultimately, it is the states, not the local municipalities, not the townships, who have the soundest judgment in this case. My opponent has repeatedly brought up the issue of New York City, not New York City, but rather New York State, and their dealings with fracking. But they neglected to mention the fact that it was in fact state regulatory agencies, state courts that delegated the right that prohibited fracking in this case. It was the states who made this sound decision that, in fact, fracking was not appropriate in that particular environmental and economic context. However, if we look at the terrible effect not in my backyard syndrome has on public mindsets at local and municipal levels, we see that the judgment is totally corrupted. And not only corrupted by misgivings, but also corrupted by money. My opponents have neglected to refute the fact that corruption can more easily occur on a local level than it can on a state or even the federal level. And the fact of the matter is, for all of these reasons, one has no choice but to negate this resolution. Thank you, and I yield the remainder of my time.
I'm going to be delivering the first affirmative rebuttal, same resolution, same partners, same Barlow. I actually kind of am fond of the strategy that my opponent used of going through environment, economy, and sort of the practicality in terms of local versus state or federal governments. So getting into the environment. I happen to think that there's been dispute about this over, even between the two of us who've had essentially the same resources to come to a conclusion. And I think that the dispute over whether it's actually good for the environment, bad for the environment, what it will actually do to the environment, we honestly have no clue. We said already in my partner's first speech that there really have been no long-term assessments of the environmental effects of fracking or even the health effects of fracking. And so I think that this debate here, that we have a debate, means that you should be leaving it up to like a local government to decide for themselves, because every single local government is going to have a different opinion on whether they're going to allow fracking or not. And just by giving it to the federal government means that you're just overriding the opinions of at least half of the 300-something million people that live in this country. In addition, my opponents brought up that switching to fracking will actually cause a decrease in the carbon footprint, which I tried to bring up a bit in cross-examination, but it's actually only it's an absolute decrease in our carbon footprint instead of a relative decrease to where we're projected to be in 22 years. So actually, when you do numbers and math, it ends up that you're actually increasing the carbon footprint. And why does this happen? They said that you're 50 to 60% more effective under shale gas usage. But this happens because the shale gas is so much cheaper that people are going to be more likely to purchase it. And also you're going to be using more shale gas and weaning off other types of green energy like solar, wind, thermal. I can go through those. And so you're actually doing worse to the environment, but I think that it should be a decision left to the individuals. I'm going to get down to the economy really quickly. The floating business means that the individual cities can decide if they're in economic hardship, whether they need the extra business, whether they need it or not. And if you give it to the government, you're going to end up with a sort of drill baby drill thing, as they're only really focused on the economic benefits instead of the environmental or even visual detriments to it. In addition, I don't think you can really moving on to the next one, I'm going to talk about the practicality of doing local versus state. And to me, it seems like what the affirmative side is saying is we're from the government and we're here to help, which it's just, and so I think that when it comes down to it, you really have to give a lot to the individual decisions of not only the people, but also the local governments. I brought up smart cars in my last cross-examination, and what I was bringing up here was you can look at a smart car, you can look at how environmentally friendly those smart cars are. And the government can't force you to buy a smart car, even if it's better for your health. We've already gone through multiple long-term assessments that say that real cars or that oil or petroleum burning cars are going to be worse environmentally and health-wise than smart cars. But still, the government can't come in and force itself upon you. Why would you want the government to come in and say we're going to build an oil well in your yard? I mean, essentially, at least in the affirmative side, if the town decides, you have more of a say in it. If the federal government decides, or even the state government, that means you have some representative coming in from Hartford who you've never met before in your life, walks into your town for the first time in probably his life, and says, you know what, this nice green field, all those trees on it, all the people playing soccer field. It's a great place for an oil platform. I don't want that to happen. I want to have at least a say in what goes on in my own town, and for that reason, you should affirm the resolution.
What? All right. Partner ready? Opponents ready? Timer ready? Judges ready? So as I close the negative side to this debate, I want to center in on these three key issues which have come across the course of the rebuttals. That of ecology, that of economy, and that of practicality, and see overall why side negative has triumphed on all of these grounds. Looking first at ecology, the key thing we have to stress here is carbon footprint, and then the second thing we need to consider is particulate matter. In terms of carbon footprint, we see a long-term 22-year study that indicates there is a decrease, be it absolute or relative, in carbon footprint. A crucial decrease that is a decrease nonetheless from the status quo. And second, in terms of particulate matter, we don't see formaldehyde on side negative. We don't see ammonia on side negative. The only thing that we could possibly see is carbon monoxide, and with the proper regulations from the EPA combined with local and municipal and state regulatory bodies, we can decrease that significantly. So with the decreased carbon emissions and decreased particulate matter, overall, we see that side negative triumphs resoundingly on the issue of ecology. Looking at the second value, the issue of economics, we see overall, if we're going to make a decision, there is a massive comparative advantage in siding with the negative on this debate. If we look at all the evidence of all the precedent we've seen, North Dakota, Pennsylvania, we see increased jobs, increased wages, increased tax revenues, increased purchasing power for citizens, increased spending, increased growth, increased gross domestic product. So if we're going to slowly climb out of an economic recovery, I'd rather have an avenue that provides for an actual growth and usage of consumer and government spending. And that's what side negative provides. So if we're siding with the economy, we once again have to side with the negative. Finally, there's the issue of practicality. And this is the key issue that we need to consider. The red tape is larger on affirmative. If we merely consider the scenario I put forth of Easton and Reading having disputes over water and where the fracking process will occur, where the derricks will be set up, between two towns which have shared water supplies, shared electrical circuits, and various other combinations. That's far more litigation than a mere state process, and it's a much more efficient way to rather have the state do it on a town-by-town basis, considering everything in toll. States have larger resources with which to do this. And not to mention, in the affirmative world, you still have the issue of corruption, which my opponents have not addressed whatsoever. And indeed, when we ask the question of government can't force you to do something, it's called a tax. In the Patent Protection and Affordable Care Act, we established that you can establish a penalty, which is a tax, which a government can use to incentivize something. And indeed, government does do this, and we all benefit from it. We see ecological and environmental benefits from doing this. So overall, the government has a compelling interest in helping us boost our overall safety. And overall safety, our overall economic safety, and our ecological safety. And finally, in response to the points that supposedly individuals don't have a say, they do have a say in the election process. Every year we elect officials to lead our states and to lead our federal government. And we trust in these peoples to do what's best for us as part of the public good. And if we're going to look at the ecology and economy and practicality of our planet and of our states, we see no choice but to side with the negative. So indeed, if someone asks, would you like a part-time job at a an oil or a fracking firm? Well, for a $23,000 increase in wages, I'm taking the offer. Thank you.
Marzaro, and I'm here for the final rebuttal of this round. Now in this speech, I'd like to take the three issues that we've been talking about and look at them through a new lens, through a lens of what would happen if you were to negate the resolution, and the lens of what would happen if you were to affirm the resolution. I'm going to begin with what would happen if you negate. Now, the first thing that would happen is the state governments would choose where fracking, where oil drilling takes place, with no extended regulations like we offer on side affirmative. Furthermore, the state interests are going to be to the detriment of the individuals in towns that the state doesn't necessarily not care about. But the fact is that even if they do care about those individual towns, policemen need to be paid their pensions in New York City. Are they going to worry about the environment in Easton, for example, or in Reading if people need their pensions in the capital? No, the fact is that is a dangerous risk to be taking. It is dangerous to put this in the hands of the states, as I've mentioned throughout this debate. Furthermore, you're taking a much greater risk in terms of environment and human health. Our opponents say that the BP crisis, the whole idea with the oil spill, was caused because the EPA couldn't regulate it, because the EPA was grossly underfunded. But I stand here today to tell you that the EPA is still grossly underfunded. That has not changed, and thus you have this risk in your backyard if you are to negate the resolution. You have an oil well in your backyard, an oil well that can maintain the same kind of tragedy that the BP oil well maintained in the Gulf. That is not something we want to risk on side affirmative. We don't want to risk things happening with fracking, things happening with having oil so close to us. Furthermore, our opponents brought up the fact that there's no carcinogens in oil. However, as I was asserting during the cross-examination, there are. You have things like sulfur dioxide, like benzene, like butane, things that can kill you, things that I don't want in my town, or I want my town to decide if it's safe enough, if the plants are distant far enough where I am safe to breathe the air. Furthermore, and lastly, you get no say in all of this. You get no say in how risky your property is and what the value of your property is when they plant that oil rig or when they start fracking behind your house, and you have to face these risks knowing that any day something horrible can happen, that you can have cancer or some deadly disease because this initiative was negated. Now I'd like to look at the affirmative world, though. The much more optimistic world, the world where things are better off for every single citizen. I'd like to look at the world where towns can assess the risks and decide whether or not it's worth it to put these plants, to put fracking or oil wells in the individual towns. If they say yes, there are the increased regulations to reduce negative externalities, the increased regulations that make sure that you also still get your economic benefit where it's safe to do so. You still get your tax reductions, your increase in wages, your increase in jobs, but only where it's safe to do so, only where we are not gambling with each and every one of our lives. Because here on Side Affirmative, we value life and we value our economy, but we know that there's a trade-off. We know that you can't throw everything you got into putting more jobs into the economy, more output, if we are risking your lives. Because the fact is, people come before profits. There is a time and there is a place to be making money from things like fracking, from things like oil drilling. This time and place comes when you have the regulations that the affirmative is putting forward, when you have no corruption, as I mentioned during my constructive speech, because you have a third-party organization, a state regulation agency, making sure that the towns, which get the final decision whether or not oil and fracking occur on their land, will regulate. And for those reasons, because we value human life and we don't gamble with each and every single one of us in this room, and because we also see the merit of possible economic boosts, but not if we have to take extreme risks that put each and every one of us in danger to do so. Because of this, I stand proud to urge the affirmation of this resolution.